guys, it's so good to have you in this session of our government tutorials. And in this session, we will be looking at the principles of a democratic government. I know that we have talked about democracy as a concept in one of our previous videos. So in this session, we're going to be looking at the principles of a democratic government. And at the end of this session, you should identify the principles of democratic government as well as to determine the application of these principles. Now I have 5 principles that we will discuss in this lesson, and 5 of them include separation of power, checks and balances, individual and collective responsibility, constitutionalism, and the rule of law. So much to talk about, but we will deal with them one by one. Now let's look at separation of powers. It is the division of political powers, not just any power, division of political powers and functions among the 3 arms of government. You remember when we talked about arms of government, look out for the videos. And the 3 arms are the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. So the division of powers among these arms of government gives you the separation of powers. That's the concept. And so each of the bodies should be constituted and involved only in the administration of that department as laid out in the Constitution. Now, why would we have separation of powers in a democracy? One is that it guarantees freedom and liberty. It reduces excesses of performance, so we don't have the judiciary doing the work of the executive. And it aids efficiency in administration. It encourages checks and balances. It maintains a stable political system. It gives us a peaceful administration. It is so democratic. And it also avoids dominance. It prevents dominance of a particular or a majority tribe over the minority tribes. It also prevents accumulation of power in one place. So when we have power separated like that, it aids administration. Now let's consider the demerits of this concept of separation of powers. One is it is rigid. It does not allow an influence or an interference of one arm to do the functions of another arm where that other arm is not doing its functions. Again, checks and balances. You find out that one arm is closely interfering or related with another arm. For instance, the executive prepares the budget and has to be approved by the legislature. You find out that it's a kind of check on the powers, but it slows down the development and growth of the government. And again, it encourages abuse of power because every arm has powers for which only that arm can operate with, so they can abuse such powers. And most importantly, total separation of powers is not even achievable. And of course, it can delay and affect performance. Now, another closely related concept is the concept of checks and balances. And the theory of checks and balances emphasizes that an arm can be a check or a watchdog over the activities of another arm. And this is to enhance the fair play, the balance of power, to remove the tendency of misuse of power by any of the organs. So like I said, this principle is an argument in support of the concept of separation of powers. Now, what are the benefits to this concept of checks and balances? One is excessive use of power is checked, and so every arm becomes a watchdog or an eye for the other arm, and so it checks the excessive use of power. It maintains orderliness and efficiency. It gives room for respect for human rights, which are entrenched in the Constitution, and it prevents dictatorship. Of course, it also enhances the control of power in the sense that everyone is just allowed to use the powers which has been awarded or consolidated for its department alone, and in its quick decision making. But then there are demerits again to this concept. One is that of interference, and so everybody becomes an eye or a check for the other, and they begin to interfere with the activities of one arm. And the powers of the president does not allow this concept to really flourish as it should. impeachment, and the power of veto. By power of veto, the president has the right to veto, and that means to deny the coming into law of a law that has been passed by the parliament. So the executive initiates a law and it is passed by the legislature, but then the president has the veto power not to bring to being that particular law. And so it's also an infringement on the exercise of the concept of checks and balances. Now, when we were talking about some forms of government, we were talking about individual responsibility and collective responsibility of ministers. Now we are going to look at individual responsibility. It is a principle in a presidential system of government. That is where it operates, individual responsibility. So this concept here, a minister is appointed by the president and he is individually responsible for any decision he makes in that ministry or department. That's the concept of individual responsibility. So he has both constitutional and political responsibilities for the department that he is in charge of. His activities are not tied against the other ministers of the cabinet. Alright, but collective responsibility, it's a feature that applies to the parliamentary system. Remember that the individual responsibility is to the presidential system, while collective responsibility is to the parliamentary system. Now, here the activities of a minister is attached to every minister in the cabinet, and cabinet meetings are held regularly and decisions are taken. These decisions are not published, and it will be a breach of the official secret to disclose. But then every member is responsible for the decisions taken. So whether there is a fall or there is a fault, every minister, of course, takes part in the blame of that government. Again, we'll be looking at constitutionalism. What really is constitutionalism? We had discussed about constitution in our previous videos, and we are looking at the concept of constitutionalism. So this concept is based on the belief that the powers of the various government or organs of government should be defined and regulated by the Constitution. So these powers of the organs of the government should be incorporated, it should be embedded in the Constitution, so that those who govern the society will do so without denying or violating any human dignity. Alright, so constitutionalism also checks and sets limits not just to the actions of government through their organs, but also the actions of the people who make up the political system. And so it defines their rights and their civic duties too. That is the concept of constitutionalism. So the constitution is where the process of constitutionalism is embedded. I'm sure you would not mix those words up because they mean differently. Now, what's the purpose of constitutionalism? To ensure fundamental rights. Yes, and it also to ensure the right to vote and contest elections, to enforce the people's rights. Of course, it also provides for the limitations in the exercise of functions by the organs of government and ensures equality before the law. Talking about equality before the law, it brings us to a concept of rule of law. What is rule of law? Rule of law is defined as the supremacy of law over everybody in a political system, and equality before the law, as well as the principle of individual rights. That is the concept of rule of law. In a nutshell, it means everybody is subject to the principles of the Constitution or the laws of the country. Everyone is subject. No one is above the law. Now, Professor A.V. Dicey had listed out 3 principles which actually show for the principles of the rule of law. One is the principle of equality. That means everyone is equal before the law. The other is the principle of impartiality. It means the law is impartial. And then the principle of individual rights. Everyone's right is protected. Now, what are the limitations to the application of the rule of law? One is immunity of head of state. Now, the Constitution provides in section 308 that the governors and the deputies, the president and the vice president cannot be instituted an action against where they be taken to court while sitting in power. Now, that's an infringement on the concept of rule of law. Until they get out of office, some actions cannot be instituted against them, as well as diplomatic immunity. So we have diplomats of other countries who reside here with us. They cannot be prosecuted against. Yes, because the Constitution also protects them. And immunity of the Parliament, where in the vicinity of the Parliament, no one can be arrested. If you are in the confines of the Parliament, you cannot be arrested until you step out. That's an immunity of the Parliament, and it also is an infringement. Delayed justice, the tribunals, delegated legislation, the rich and the privileged view, the type of government, the state of emergency where curfew can be declared, and all of these things, unlawful detention, arrest and torture, can also be limitations to the application of the rule of law. We've come to the end of this session where we've been able to talk about the principles of democratic government. And I am very sure that when you see these things play out in your state, in your country, you will be sure to say that your country is a democratic one. Do have a good time.